McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and I'm joined again with my co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Well, we have one of the most interesting programs and topics, not to mention guests, that we've ever had the opportunity to visit with, and the timeliness of it is what makes it even more important. So, Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the program's going to cover, and then introduce our special guest.
I will indeed, and I hope we feel as well after today's program because we may be a little bit more worried. You know, the fifth domain, cyber, is the newest arena for warfare, following land, air, sea, and space. And it's different from other forms of conflict because the aggressor may not be a foreign country. And even if it is, we may not know who is really responsible. Our guest, Richard Clarke, has been thinking about these issues for over 3 decades, both in government and outside. He was our nation's first cyber czar, and he served with the National Security Agency for a number of years, including having the position of National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, and he was Special Advisor to the President for Cybersecurity. He's a remarkable author, fiction and nonfiction. In his last book is The Fifth Domain, Defending Our Country, Our Companies, and Ourselves in an Age of Cyber Threats. Dick, great to see you. How worried should we be about the integrity of our electoral process?
Well, I think the major thing that we've seen happen so far is Russia, again, as they did 4 years ago, manipulating social media to affect people's decisions. What we have not yet seen, but could happen, is hacking into particular voting districts, going after either the lists of voters and altering that, or going into the counting mechanisms and altering that. I believe they could do that on a limited basis in some states, but I think their overall game plan is to get us to vote the way they want us to vote. And I know when I say that, most people say, well, my mind isn't made up by what I hear from the Russians. No, of course not. But it is made up by what you hear from your peers. And if somebody appears to be one of your neighbors, one of your ethnic group, one of your racial group, one of your political group, if they appear to be that, and they offer you a fact here, a fact there, and there's a whole network of these people slowly working on you over the course of months, shaping your opinion, that can have an outcome. And what we saw 4 years ago is that the Russians had very detailed information about individual voters and their preferences, what issues mattered to them. And so they micro-targeted the way Google can do, the way good advertising firms do. They micro-targeted Americans. And for some places, they didn't go after the whole country. For key battleground states, they went in and told people who were interested in the environment, Hillary's going to win anyway. So do a protest vote for the Green Party because you like the environment. Well, of course, people did. And in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, battleground states that Trump won, the Green Party got more votes than Trump's margin of victory over Clinton. In other words, if the Green Party hadn't been on the ballot, or if they had only received a small number of votes, Clinton would have won. So just that alone, persuading people to vote for the Green Party in those 3 states affected the outcome. They also sent messages to African Americans, particularly in Philadelphia, telling them not to vote for a variety of made-up reasons. So none of us think we're being manipulated by Russians, but a lot of us were. And that's happening again this year. We know it is. The FBI says it is. But I suspect the Russians always up the game. You know, they always do more than they did the last time. I suspect they're going to do something in addition to that. And I don't know what it is yet, but I'm suspicious that it will somehow go after the counting mechanisms and the vote registration lists, because we know they hacked into the vote registration lists.
And just raising that question can put the whole election legitimacy in doubt. You're focusing on Russia, and so is the media, but what about China or North Korea or even Iran?
So far as I can tell, talking to people both in and out of the government who monitor this closely, it's really been only Russia that has done a significant campaign. There are little attempts of shaping by China, but nothing on the scale, nothing that would have any significant result. They're just kind of stating their opinion.
You actually had the technology now where you had the ability to look back up through the computer lines, up through a 12-story building in China, and actually look at the computer of the young man who was hacking your client. Am I right about that?
Well, I think there's something close to that.
Close to that. Yeah.
Let me say what I think you're remembering. The Justice Department has indicted individual Chinese army hackers for attacking specific companies in the United States.
Right.
So that they've taken specific attacks, particularly in the Pittsburgh area, because that's where the FBI has its best technicians for this sort of thing. They've looked at specific attacks, identified China as having been the attacker, and then gone beyond that to identify the individual hacker that did it, and they have indicted them in Pennsylvania at the federal level, and they've then published the pictures of the hackers. So I know a lot of people think hacking can achieve a great deal of anonymity, but here's the FBI and the Justice Department saying it's this individual Chinese military officer who did this specific hack against this specific company, and here's his picture. And they've done that now also for Iranian hackers and Russian hackers as well. Now that would lead me to believe, without disclosing any classified information here, that would lead me to believe that somehow we're getting pictures of the hackers. And I don't know, there are cameras, I understand, in computers, and unless you do this, you know, and put your thumb over the camera or put a piece of tape over the camera, maybe somebody could hack into your computer and get a picture of you.
Well, so hopefully that would be a good discouragement to people.
Well, that's the idea. That's why they've been indicted. We don't expect to get any of these people in the United States and put them on trial. Although I will say, from time to time, hackers screw up and they go on vacation to countries where they think that they'll be safe, but those countries have extradition treaties with the United States. Somehow we know when they're going on vacation, and we ask that country to arrest them.
I read your book and really encourage others to do so. And one of the parts of that I found so interesting was how you address the balance between the responsibility of corporations, the private sector, and the government. And I wonder if you might elaborate on that now.
You know, I take the attitude that if you're a corporate official, if you're a member of a corporate board, as I am, if you are a CEO or C-suite official, it's up to you to defend your company. You might like to think that you can pay taxes and the military, the US military, will defend you against Russia's army or China's army. Well, they will, if the Russian army or Chinese army is landing on the New Jersey shores or flying bombers over California, then you can count on the Pentagon defending you. But if it's a cyber attack, you have to defend yourself. And there's a long, complicated discussion we could have about why that's the case. But just accept that that's the way it is right now, that you have to defend yourself. And that means you have to spend money. And when people say to me, well, I'm not willing to spend 10% of my IT budget every year defending the company, that's kind of like saying I'm not willing to pay for electricity, or I'm not willing to pay the water bill. Paying around 10% of your IT budget every year to defend your company is table stakes. And if you don't do it, I think you're an irresponsible fiduciary. And if you do spend that level of money today, and this is the message of the book, The Fifth Domain, today you can successfully defend yourself. There are
Dick,
technologies out there
Dick,
that work.
I think one of the things that the reason that book has been so successful for you and recommended to so many other people is because you are optimistic that it can be done, that the defense mechanisms can overcome the offensive strikes, which is really good. I called a director friend of mine this morning, and he's on the board of a company that was recently cyber attacked. I won't mention the name of the company, but I said to him, I said, give me something that I can share with that viewer on today's program. And he said this, just what you said. The idea of protecting yourself is now got to be seen as a cost of doing business. It just is that important, and that's what needs to happen right now. So that part was great. Jim?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm curious about is I just read yesterday here in the state of Texas, a small town was hacked. And so when you talk about responsibility, this town has a small budget and it doesn't have the budget or the will really to spend on cyber defense. Isn't there then a responsibility of government to take a larger role?
Yeah, and I think governor may be the right answer there. I believe that there are too many government entities that are trying to do it on their own, and you're right. It's too expensive. It requires too much expertise. I think I'm in the state of Virginia. What we've done here is we've taken all of the 42, I think it is, state agencies and made them all get their IT services from the new Department of IT Services at the state level. Instead of having 42 agencies all trying to defend themselves, we've got one place to do it. And in a small town in Texas ought to be able to link up with a state of Texas network and have the state of Texas provide that as a service to the counties and the towns and the cities if they can't do it themselves.
And going a step farther, what about our infrastructure? Again, when I read your book, I just realized how many different instances there have been of attacks on water or electricity in the United States and across the world.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so far, we have not had a devastating cyber attack in the United States on electricity, but Russia has done that to Ukraine, for example. So we know it can be done. And frankly, I think I can say this publicly, we know we can do it too. We have looked at whether or not it's possible to destroy other people's networks. And it is. So the electric power companies say, well, we can't afford to do the defensive things you want us to do. Yes, they can, because they're all regulated. And what they can do is go back to the regulator and say, we need to raise the rates because it's going to cost us more money to do the needed security. And for some reason, they're reluctant to do that, but it's not as though someone is going to not buy their electricity from them. I think we just have to accept that this is going to cost more.
Dick, in doing some research on how we got to this fifth domain, as it's being called now, it seemed to me that originally it was called the fifth dimension. That is ground, sea, air, space, and cyber became the fifth dimension. But I guess we all got confused with the singing group of the 70s, and so it had to go to the fifth domain. But here's my question. We sort of knew back in the past when someone had committed an act of war, they might either send ground troops across the border, or later on they might send airplanes across the English Channel or something like that. Today, sending something through cyberspace, and I think of Stuxnet, which was in your book as an example, and other examples like that, what do you see constitutes an act of war, and what's just, let's just say, normal government playing and seeing how far they can push the envelope?
Well, Dennis, that's a great question, and it's being worked out in the courts, as you might suspect. And there are a couple of cases working their way through the courts where insurance companies are refusing to pay for damages from cyber attacks because they say these attacks were acts of war. They were perpetrated by foreign militaries, and therefore they're exempt from insurance coverage. We'll find out what the courts say. My definition of an act of war is when one nation state destroys something or damages something significantly in another nation state. That's an act of war. Now, an act of war and war are two different things. As you know, there's often been acts of war that haven't led to further war. But I think there have been in cyberspace already a lot of acts of war, including by us. You mentioned Stuxnet. I think when the United States damaged and destroyed facilities in the Iranian nuclear program, that technically, legally, on international law, was probably an act of war.
Dick, talk more about Russia's strategy, because exactly what they've been doing is slightly under a clear act of war, not to trigger NATO's Article 5.
Yeah, the Russians realized a long time ago that militarily they can't compete with us. And so they're engaged in what they call hybrid war, where they use special forces. They use Russian troops pretending not to be Russian troops, the so-called little green men who invaded Ukraine. They use psychological operations. They use disinformation, cyber attacks, espionage, suborning people with money. They use very, very well the whole range of instruments to get to their strategic goal. And they're always focused on their strategic goal. In this case, their strategic goal is to break up the United States the way they think we broke up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's now half a dozen countries or more, I guess, more. And Putin remembers the good old days of the Soviet Union, would love to have it back. But if he can't have it back, he at least wants to retaliate against us by doing the same thing to us, by driving us to another civil war, or to sponsor people wanting to break off, like having California become its own country or something like that. Now, I know that sounds crazy to us, but it sounds a lot less crazy than it did 3 years ago.
What about the impact of quantum computing? How is that going to change our ability to protect ourselves?
Well, quantum computing, when it works at scale, and we could spend an hour defining quantum computing. I tried really hard in the book, The Fifth Domain, to explain quantum computing to the average reader, and that was the hardest writing I've ever done. So I'm not going to try to repeat it here, but if you don't know what quantum computing is, look it up in the book or elsewhere. But it is a kind of computing that is thousands of times faster and operates in parallel. And so it will be able to do, once it works at scale, it will be able to do calculations that we've never been able to do before, including calculations involved in cracking codes that we've never been able to crack. So some people believe, this is controversial, but some people believe that when a nation gets a quantum computer, it will be able to read all the other nations' secrets, break all of their codes, and therefore they won't want to tell them. So, if China gets there first and starts reading our codes and everybody else's, they're not going to announce that, and we're not going to know.
What's your sense of who's leading the race?
Well, I don't know, because so much of the development is secret. We certainly know what's going on in public, private sector companies, venture capital-backed companies, and it seems pretty much a two-person race between China and the United States. And China has done some things that the United States has not yet done, and so you might think they're ahead, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Where does artificial intelligence fit into this discussion?
Well, artificial intelligence is everywhere. People think it's something in the future. No, it's happening all the time, everywhere. When you swipe your credit card at a store, or you make an online purchase with your credit card, chances are that there's a artificial intelligence program operating very quickly in the background to figure out if it's really you. And they take into account upwards of 20 different factors to determine if you're you. Is Jim really in this location? Did Jim ever buy anything like this before? A whole series of questions that artificial intelligence answers in a nanosecond and says, yeah, this is probably Jim. Let's let the action go ahead. The stock market is run by artificial intelligence. Most of the stock market purchases these days are done by algorithms and not by individuals saying, oh, gee, I think I want that stock. Most of the shifts are done by algorithms. So artificial intelligence is everywhere. It's beginning to defend networks against hackers by doing very narrow little specific things like, is this really Jim logging in to the network? Why is Jim looking at the R&D files when he works in finance? So my hope is that artificial intelligence will get more intelligent. And someday we'll be able to say to an AI program, here, you defend the network, and just go hands off and let it defend the network.
Well, I sure hope you're right about that. Here's a concern that that some people, including myself, have, and that is we've got all this cyber security information. We've got all the cyber intelligence. We've got all these connections everywhere. And in the 20th century, there were more people who died at the hands of their own government than there were in all those nasty wars. You don't know this, Dick, but in addition to doing this program for 30 years, I spent the last 10 years until I retired in May teaching corporate governance and teaching things to primarily graduate students, many of whom were Chinese. And when I played them videos of things, let's say one of the generals that Jim Falk interviewed here for the World Affairs Council, when I played them a video talking about what the problems are with all the things that China is doing within their own country, the credit score, the social credit score that they have for their own citizens. I mean, on the one hand, it got their attention. On the other hand, they were much more sanguine about it than I am. Talk to us about that particular concept and how that can affect this issue that we're discussing here.
China is creating a high-tech police state where they know where everybody is at any given second. They can track them from their phone, from cameras that are everywhere. They know everything that they do. And you're right, everybody gets a score as to how good you are as a citizen. And if you're not, if you don't have a high score, you don't get to buy a ticket in first class. Or maybe you have to go on the slow train and instead of the fast train. There are all sorts of incentives to follow the party line. And they're using cameras, they're using facial recognition, they're using artificial intelligence, and they're creating a police state where there's a big incentive to play along. It's creepy, but it's using existing technology. It could happen here. Thank God it hasn't. I think we'd all fight that.
We have just a minute or two left, and I wanted to ask you about the role of international organizations, their agreements and treaties that are involved with war and nuclear proliferation. Anything along those lines with cyber warfare?
Not really. There's some minor agreements here and there. What we need to do is to start that process, I think, Jim. We need to start arms control in cyberspace, arms control of cyber war, so that someday, maybe 10, 15 years from now, it'll take a long time, we'll get to cyber peace instead of cyber war. But we have to start taking those first steps. They're always difficult, and it takes a long time. It takes smart people, people of goodwill. But I think it's incumbent upon the United States to get a group of like-minded nations together and then go to the scofflaws like Russia and China and say, all right, let's negotiate.
And hopefully take a leadership role. Dennis?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jim. You were right on target with the leadership role. And we seem to be such a divided country ourselves right now. We're not sure where we are in the world, whether we're the leader or the follower or leading from behind or whatever we're supposed to be doing. But we appreciate, Dick, what you do and what your associates do to try to keep us educated and safe and secure and on the cutting edge of all of the things we need to do. And for that viewer, Jim and I appreciate your joining us. Try other programs similar to this on McCuistionTV.com. Follow us on Twitter and understand that we're always trying to provide you perspectives that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.